When I was a kid, I was on this show called Jerry's Place. The show has basically been erased from the public's consciousness, so don't rack your brain if you don't remember it. We worked for a small Canadian studio, hoping to market the show to an American audience. Half of season 1 never even aired in Canada, not after the incident. The show followed a fairly typical formula. There was a father and a mother character, wise yet silly parents, who dispensed advice and hugs in equal parts. An older sibling who was aloof and angsty and brought friends over to add color to our small cast. The two younger siblings, one of them very young and the other around 9 or 10, who were there to make hijinks and generally move the story along. The later was me. I was the middle child, and I was usually responsible for comic relief or having some part in the week's story. The two adult characters were Linda and Mike, and they were actually pretty cool. Mike was a lifelong actor who always had a word of advice or a smile if you felt scared. As someone who grew up without a father, Mike was the person I used as a model for what a man should be, though it probably became intertwined with his character on the show to a certain degree. Linda was great too, a mom with kids of her own who was always looking after us when we weren't shooting on set and making sure that we got enough to eat. My own mother was working 2 jobs to keep the lights on at home, so there were evenings where I would join Linda and her children for family dinners until my mom could pick me up. Linda and Mike were almost like surrogate parents to me during that time of my life, and Rachel and Mark almost became like adopted siblings. Rachel was the older sister, angsty and above it all on camera, but she was always very nice off screen. Rachel would run lines with me when I was scared, and always helped me when I needed something. She was actually 19, though she played a 16-year-old, and on the nights when Linda couldn't take me, I would hang out with Rachel until my mom came and picked me up. Mark, the younger boy, was 6, and we weren't too far off in age, really. We had similar interests, and we would often sit around off screen and talk about Ninja Turtles or Power Rangers, or play Game Boys together. In many ways, those 5 people became family to me for that year and a half. It makes the rest of the story all the harder to tell. It was a typical day of shooting. We had finished what would have been season 1, and were shooting some scenes for season 2. The network had been pleased with our viewership so far, so a second season seemed to be in the cards. With the second season, though, came a live audience. This was the 90s, and live audiences were all the rage. The first season had been live a few times, for select episodes, but this season would have a live audience throughout. The presence of an audience was a bit of a distraction, and often led to Mark and I playing it up a little bit for their attention. We had been asked to ignore them, but we were young, and the laughter of adults meant a lot to us. We were in episode 6 of season 2, when a very different audience wandered in. I remember it perfectly. The event gouged into my mind surgically. We were setting up for the opening scene when the stage door opened and a crowd of people filed in. There were about 20 of them in all. Our audiences tended to be small, and I can remember not seeing any kids or strollers as they filed into the dark rows. Our show was loved by people of all ages. You could usually count on a few kids being in the live audience during recording. Usually they brought the house lights up, allowing us to see the audience, but today the crowd sat in shadow. Mark whispered to me about it, saying they looked a little creepy, all huddled up in the dark like that. I told him it was probably just something new the directors were doing to make us ignore them. We set up for the shot, and I found myself looking at the crowd out of the corner of my eye. It wasn't that dark out there. Not really. But the whole audience sat in a small sea of shadows that seemed to crowd around them. They didn't talk. They didn't shuffle. They just hunched there and waited for us to begin. We rolled the opening. Jerry's Place is filmed before a live studio audience. And away we went. As Mike came on stage, the titular Jerry, I had expected the crowd to clap as they usually did when a character came onto scene. They didn't, though. They just sat there, waiting. The director looked back at them and shrugged, whispering something to his assistant. Mike looked up at the audience strangely too, but he was a pro and didn't let it mess him up. Linda and Rachel, Megan and Bonnie on the show, were watching TV as Mike walked in from the kitchen and delivered his lines. They cued Mark and me to run downstairs and begin the show's problem, a broken toy that was important to me. By the end of the show, Mark would have saved enough money to buy me a new one, and I would learn a lesson about sharing. Everyone at home would feel warm and fuzzy as my brother and I hugged it out, and the show would end on a high note. At least, that's how it should have gone. I came downstairs yelling about my toy, a model airplane, and Mark was right behind me in typical little brother fashion. Mike looked at the plane and asked if I couldn't just use it like this, as I hit my mark and prepared to deliver my character's catchphrase. Catchphrases were prominent in the 90s. They were also very marketable, and my catchphrase was supposed to elicit laughs from the audience. Until then, they had just been sitting quietly. I wish maybe they had stayed quiet. Play with a broken toy? That's gonna be a deal breaker for me, Pops, I said, looking at the audience as I did so. That's when they started to laugh. I was expecting a chuckle, maybe even a full-fledged laugh or two. The audience surprised me by emanating a hearty, canned laughter, the kind you hear on sitcoms when the real audience might be too much. Mike started to give his next line, but the audience just kept laughing. I looked at them, my face still holding that mischievous smile that it always did after my catchphrase, and saw that the shadowy crowd was laughing and heaving in unison. The shadowy mob was hitching and chuckling as one being, and as I watched, I felt my smile faltering. Mike tried to give his next line again, but the laughter overtopped him. The director said something to his assistant, and the man brought out a cue card that read, "Quiet, please." He held it high, right in front of the audience, but they just kept on laughing. Their laughter had begun to make me uneasy. The longer they laughed, the more uniform and unchanging their laughter became. It should have been impossible for someone to laugh like that for that long, but they laughed through it. The laughter never rose or fell in volume, just the mad, canned laughter I would become familiar with later in life. It was emotionless and inhuman, and it just continued to pour out of them as they huddled in the shadows. The assistant shouted at the crowd then, the director calling for the cameras to be cut. One of the cameramen, I can't remember his name, but he was always kind of a jokester, turned the camera to film the crowd. Maybe he thought it would be great for a gag reel or something. Perhaps he thought the studio was playing a joke on us. But whatever he was thinking, he had an excellent seat for what happened next. When the assistant's shouts failed to gain any attention, he walked into the seats and started yelling at the crowd. That's when his angry shouts turned into overwhelming laughter, and he too started chuckling. The director turned and started shouting at the crowd to be quiet, even as he shouted at his assistant to come down. We had all started milling about close to our marks so we could start again. I couldn't help but notice Rachel and Linda on the couch, and how Linda had a protective arm around her. They looked scared, and despite being trained to stay close to our marks, I went over and sat with them, wanting to be in that protective bubble. A stagehand had gone into the audience to get the assistant back, but now he was sitting and chuckling right along with the rest of them. It was that same canned laughter, but they sounded like lunatics now. They were consistent, unchanging in pitch or fervor, and it was all becoming too spooky for me. Mark came and sat beside me, and I wrapped a brotherly arm around him just as Linda had. "I don't like it. They're scaring me," Mark cried as big tears rolled down his cheek. I told him that I was pretty scared too, and when Mike came up to put his hand on the back of the couch, I felt safe knowing that he was there. As we sat and watched, another stagehand went up. He grasped the first one by the arm, pulling at him as he tried to get him to leave, but soon he too was laughing and grinning as he took a seat beside the other one. After that, the director forbade anyone else to go up. The crew sat huddled together on the edge of the stage as they tried to figure out what was happening. The director sent a stagehand to get security, but the stagehand found the doors to be locked. None of the keys would open them, and he came back white-faced, skirting the audience, as if whatever they had might be catching. The director sent someone to see if the roof access was open, but they discovered the same thing. Keys didn't work, and the hatch was locked. Someone tried a landline in the back, but found no dial tone. This was before cell phones had become a norm, but the director had a bag phone that he tried. Same thing, no dial tone, no call would go out. And all the while, they laughed. Even after an hour, they still just laughed. The director and some of the crew had come to sit around the couch. They had brought items from the food service table, and we all just kind of had a picnic. It would have been nice had the creepy laughing shadow people not been staring at us the whole time. As we ate, I noticed that some of the crew had stayed away and seemed to be eating on the outskirts. They kept looking at the crowd, some of them staring, and when I asked the director about them, he shook his head. One of them claims that his father is sitting in the audience. "What?" Mike asked, his mouth full of sandwich. "He says the man in the front row near the middle is his father. He says it can't be him, because he died of lung cancer last year, but it definitely looks like him. He says that the laughing man will look at him every now and again and try to wave him over. He knows he shouldn't go, but he says that it's hard not to go every time the guy waves at him." "That's nuts," Linda breathed. Each of them has a story like that, the director said. For Carrie, he pointed to the redhead with the ponytail, it's her girlfriend who left for New Mexico and never came back. For Steve, he pointed to the guy with the salt and pepper crew cut, it's his sister who stopped talking to him after his parents left him everything in their will. They all have someone, all of them thinking they might, but as he spoke, we saw Carrie get up and take a step towards the chuckling crowd. Steve grabbed at her, but she shrugged him off and walked towards the crowd like someone in a dream. She embraced one of the shadowy masses and then sat next to them, chuckling and smiling as her butt pressed into the seat. After Steve left too, the director decided to take action. He told one of the hands near us to turn on the house lights. He wanted lights on the crowd so we could see who they were. Maybe they would stop laughing if their covers were blown, and this would be all over, and we could all get back to work. He still seemed to think that this might be a prank, though not a very funny one, and wanted an end to it already. Some of the stage hands went to get things set up, but we all kept looking at that quietly chuckling behemoth. Mark had fallen asleep somehow, and I kept my arm wrapped around him as though I might stand between him and the tide should they change. I was still munching absent-mindedly at fruit from the food table, and I didn't notice Rachel getting up until my bowl of honeydew almost tipped over. Linda grabbed her wrist, anchoring her to the couch, but I could see that her eyes were big and starry when I looked up. Her blonde hair bobbed a little as she scanned the crowd, and Linda started asking her what she was looking for. I thought I saw someone up there, someone I haven't seen in a very long... But she gasped harshly and said, It's him! It's him! Oh my God! She was pulling against Linda's hand, but Linda refused to let her go. Who, Rachel? Who is it? Linda asked, trying to restrain the girl as Mike moved to help. It's my dad! My dad's up there! He looks just like he did on the photo Mom has on her dresser. He hasn't changed a bit! I looked at the crowd, trying to see who she was talking about, but failed. Rach, your dad died when you were born. Your mother told me about the accident. It can't be him. But it is, Rachel almost screamed, pitching her body from side to side as she tried to break free. Mike and Linda held her tightly, and I scooted closer to Mark so Mike could sit on the couch. The two of them sat there and held her as she sobbed for them to let her go. She used a lot of swear words as she thrashed about, but they refused to let go of her. When she finally stopped, she sat crying into Linda's shoulder as the two of them hugged her tightly. Someone yelled down from the catwalk then, and the stage was suddenly awash with light. The overheads were unbearably bright, and as they were all lit at once, I remember tinting my eyes with my hands so I didn't go blind. We had used them for a beach scene a few times when rain caused us not to shoot on location, and I can remember thinking that they were so much brighter than the real sun. They lit up every corner of the set, but I realized I had been wrong as I squinted at the seats. Every corner but that one, it seemed. The seats were still in a pool of shadow, but when the light hit them, everything changed. The low chuckling became a strange hybrid of screaming and deep booming laughter, the kind of laughter you heard in an insane asylum, the kind of laughter you heard in hell. The people in the seats never moved, but the darkness did. It plumed out like a fog and started rolling towards us. Those sitting near the seats were hit, and I could hear them laughing as they fell to their knees and clutched their stomachs. The director shouted at the crew to kill the lights, but it was much too late. The darkness was angry now, and it was no longer satisfied with the few people it had in the seats. It was coming for us. Mike grabbed Mark and I, lifting us up in his strong arms, and started running backstage. He turned to yell at Linda as she fought with Rachel, the girl trying to free herself again. She was straining towards the fog, and it was creeping in to get both of them. Mike yelled for her to let Rachel go if she wouldn't come, but Linda refused to leave her there. She strained and pulled at the girl, but Rachel was apparently stronger than she looked. It didn't matter a moment later as the fog rolled in, and they were both little more than chuckling shadows. Mike ran to the back, Mark crying and asking what was going on. He had woken up when Mike picked him up, and Mike was looking frantically for some way to escape. Mike saw a window and lifted a piece of wood to smash it out. As he brought the wood down, however, he might as well have been hitting concrete, because the board bounced off, splinters flying. The dark fog was rolling past the set walls now, and Mike was almost out of options. Mark and I just stood there, eyes roving around like scared dogs, trying to make sense of what was happening. Finally, Mike settled on a closet. It was full of brooms and mops, but we didn't have time to move any at that point. Mike pushed us in and sighed as he saw how much room was left. As the fog plumed behind him, he slammed the door and left us in total darkness. His laughter started a few minutes later, and the sound nearly drove us mad as we huddled in the tiny closet. Mark and I hunched, arms wrapped around each other, expecting that we would both begin to laugh any minute. We sat like that for a long time. I have no idea how long exactly, but both of us fell asleep to the sound of Mike's choking laughter. When I woke up, I was in a hospital. My mother was asleep in the chair next to my bed. I got the whole story a few days later. My mother didn't know much, but she had come to the set only to find all the doors locked and police trying to get in. Once they had gotten in, some of them started laughing and couldn't stop. The paramedics and the fire department had come. After searching the place with breathing equipment, they found Mark and I and brought us safely out. There was nothing wrong with either of us, not physically, but the two of us had been catatonic for the last 3 days. The man from the studio, the one in the pristine suit and the oiled hair, told me a very different story. He said that it was some kind of gas leak and claimed that most of those present had been hallucinating due to the gas. The audience, cast and crew had all died due to gas inhalation, and Mark and I had been lucky to survive. Our parents had both signed non-disclosure agreements. We would promise not to talk about anything in exchange for a large amount of financial compensation. My mother and I needed the money, now that the show was going to be canceled. Both our parents signed, and Mark and I went our separate ways. The whole event was deemed a tragic accident, and I never worked in showbiz again. That would be the end of this story, if it weren't for the email I received a week ago. I'm in my 30s now, and about a week ago, I got a Facebook request from Mark. I'd expected that he wanted to catch up, have a beer, and share some old stories, but his first message was far from what I expected. He sent me a message a few seconds later, and after accepting, he sent me 7 words. Are they still laughing for you, too? We met up for that beer the next day. Mark was older, but far from doing well. The guy looked rough, borderline homeless, and seemed eternally looking around to see who was near him. He asked if I still heard the laughter. I told him I hadn't, not since that day all those years ago. He said that for him, it had never stopped. He would wake up to see shadowy figures at the end of his bed, that canned laughter bubbling from their dark lips. He said Rachel and Linda and Mike were right out front, 2 white teeth smiling as they laughed and laughed. His parents hadn't believed him. They thought it was just bad dreams because of the incident. The drugs the shrink gave him just meant that he was a drooling zombie, as the laughing apparitions chuckled on and on. He started using young. First it was alcohol. His dad had a cabinet in the living room. Then drugs when he was in high school. He stole prescription medication, used blends of different drugs, drank himself into oblivion, but nothing helped. Every night they were waiting for him. Every night he screamed until they disappeared with the light of day or the arrival of someone else. Just wanted to see if you'd found a way to make them stop too, big brother, he said sadly as he left the bar. He killed himself a week later. Put a gun in his mouth, and the rest is pretty easy to figure out. I envy him now. I envy that he had the strength to do what needed to be done. About a week ago, I woke up to the sound of that canned laughter that always creeped me out in sitcoms. I fumbled for the remote, thinking I'd just left the TV on, but as the TV came to life, I saw them. They were arrayed at the foot of my bed, their bodies made of living darkness, made all the murkier by the light of the TV, and their laughter went on and on. Mark was among them, his unkempt hair now a raven mane of living shadow. Mike was there too, and Linda, and Rachel, all of them laughing and laughing as I lay in bed, frozen in terror. They left with the sun, and I got up to write this. I don't know how long I can take this. I'm afraid to go to sleep, afraid to see them, but I'm too afraid to take Mark's way out. I see him amongst them, laughing and laughing like an audience in hell, and I wonder if I'll join them at the end too. I'm afraid to go to sleep, afraid to be awake, afraid to see their faces, and afraid of running into them again. My eyes are getting heavy. The 4th cup of coffee is jittering in my hand. I wonder if it hurts to laugh forever. Perhaps I'll find out soon. The room was dark, the smoke clouds wafting up to obscure the overheads that made the man's shiny face all the more noticeable. He was sweating heavily, stammering out the last few minutes of his set as he told the crowd about an incident with his mother when he was 12. The audience, stoners, hipsters who've been drinking since noon, watched him like a bug under a microscope. They wanted to be interested in what he was saying, but really, they were just hoping he would burn up in the harsh overhead lights. At the end of the day, there's nothing better than watching a comedian crash spectacularly. I took a swig of my lukewarm beer and made notes in my notebook. I'd been doing comedy for about a year, and doing comedy is a lot like Alcoholics Anonymous. The guys who have been doing it longer than you are always super smug about it, and they have 1,000 different sayings. They just tell you to keep working the program, no matter how much you hate it. In this case, the program was a 15-minute set. Randy, a 5-year vet of the stage, had found me doing stand-up at my college. He said I had some chops, but suggested that I work on my 15-minute set until I knew it backwards and forwards. Once you know that set better than you know your own hand, then you can start adding new stuff. 6 months later, I'd been doing the same set for 6 months without fail. I felt that I knew it well. I could have quoted it in my sleep, and I had tried to add some new material from time to time. The bits were snappy, the one-liners were delivered perfectly, and Randy had even said that some of my new stuff was good, though off script. I felt that my bits were topical, without being inflammatory, and that my stories landed without being too long-winded. I wasn't ready for Comedy Central, but I was more than prepared for the little dive bars that seemed to be where I was cutting my teeth. So, why was I only receiving middling laughs? The guy on stage, I hadn't bothered to learn his name, stumbled off the stage to some polite, if not strained, applause. He flopped onto the couch next to me, wiping the sweat off his forehead. Randy took the mic and started attempting to get the crowd excited for the next comedian. Randy was usually the MC of these events. His reputation had been made over a half a decade of funny, and the crowd was always glad to see him. He was building me up, getting the crowd hyped for my set, and as he introduced me, I stood up to scattered applause and made my way to the stage. I mounted the stage, a beer in one hand and my notebook in the other, and I set up for the crowd as they murmured and coughed. I adjusted the mic, dropping it a little from Randy's 7-foot-tall height, and the audience seemed to find this amusing. I could see many familiar faces sitting amongst the smoke, and smelled the cheap beer aroma of whatever was on tap. The audience was almost always the same barflies and regulars who came to hear the same jokes repeatedly. I was always happy to see them, and their tip money at the end of the night, but I remember wishing for some new blood amongst the spattering of drunks and stoners. Oh, how God mocked me with his answer. So I'm pro-gun, hold your booze. A few half-hearted boos came from the crowd as though in answer. Someone online asked me the other day if that meant I would shoot a home invader, which it does, but as a comedian who works for tips, I don't usually have anything worth stealing, so it's not usually a problem. Some scattered laughs followed this. Well, they always followed up by asking, "What, don't you value human life more than things?" Well, I tell them, clearly he valued my things more than his life, so I must have nicer shit than I thought. Some half-hearted laughs greeted the end of my joke, but they were perfunctory at best. The crowd came in just as I was setting up the next joke. Have you heard of this guy that makes paper out of elephant dung? Yeah, I shit you not. They take the dung, clean it, press it, clean it again, I hope, and, through a process known only to the paper maker, they create an eco-friendly paper that's safe for the environment. The crowd shuffled in as I set up my punchline, and though I couldn't tell exactly how many there were, it looked like at least 20 people as they filed into the back of the room. I couldn't tell if they sat down or not. The room seemed to get darker as they filled the space. They didn't fill in the empty spaces left by the sparse crowd. They just kind of hovered near the back of the room, in a cloud of strange silence. I realized I had paused a moment too long, and was stretching my punchline out before I continued. But it's like they say, isn't it? One elephant's crap is another man's 50 Shades of Grey. The crowd actually laughed at that one. This joke was so ridiculous that it never failed to get laughs. The group in the back, however, burst into sudden and immediate laughter. The laughter was welcome, but a little unexpected. It was hearty, almost manufactured, and it rolled out in a jolly wave that seemed to take some people by surprise. I saw people in the front jump a little as 20 or so people burst into spontaneous laughter, and I smiled a little, nodding and asking if they liked that joke or something, before continuing on with my next one. The crowd of newcomers were definitely what we needed around here, and I rode the wave of their laughter into my next bit. You ever wonder why you never see any hipster necrophiliacs? The front row shook their head, but the back continued to laugh mechanically, 'cause they'd have to screw 'em before they get cool. The laughs from the front were more akin to groans as they accepted the corny joke, but the back of the house burst into the same mechanical laughter they had before. I was energized. I was pumped. I was receiving what I thought was my due at long last. These people were eating up what I was putting down, and it tempted me to do something I'd been working on, but just hadn't brought out yet. So my mom called the other day, and the crowd in the back hadn't stopped laughing, though. They buzzed with this sort of constant canned laughter as the others died down and waited for the next joke. Some had turned to look at the crowd behind them, and I could see some of the other comedians looking at them with misgivings. Their laughter never changed, never rose or fell in volume, but kept chuckling out in that fake sitcom laughter you always hear on Friends or How I Met Your Mother. She lives in a small town, 2 stoplights and a Walmart, and the town has a dog that's become a sort of... I was starting to lose my focus as the crowd kept laughing. They never tired, never stopped, and I could see one of the comedians getting up to say something. The audience wasn't watching me anymore. They were all craning around in their seats, looking at the crowd that chuckled on and on. The comedian, it was Mark for sure, walked towards the back. As he did, he was suddenly obscured by the smoky darkness that seemed unaffected by the murky overheads that flanked the stage. He stopped on the fringes, saying something to them as they laughed in response. He suddenly clapped his knees and began to bray that donkey laughter I had heard from the stage on many occasions. He laughed long and hard, joining the throng as his brays were lost amongst the grating mirth. After a few seconds, his unique sound was lost amongst their glee. Town mascot, I continued as I tried to power through it. It sleeps in the middle of the road. People feed it and leave it water. They drive around it and bring it inside at night, and everybody knows who he is and why he's there. I was losing focus. I could see Randy approaching the stage, plugging in a mic so he could remind the crowd to keep it down and respect the comedians. And I hoped that this was just some kind of prank. The laughter had been going for nearly 2 minutes now, and it was becoming abrasive. It was no longer flattering. I was no longer heartened by the laughter. I was becoming creeped out, and if this was someone's idea of a joke, it wasn't very funny. I heard the static when Randy's mic slipped in. Okay, people, let's remember to respect the comedians and keep our laughter to a respectable level, okay? The laughter continued, uninterrupted. I stood on the raised stage, looking out into the inky blackness and watching the chuckling tide. They rumbled out their artificial laughter in the face of my confusion, Randy standing by the stage, glaring at them. When he sat the mic down, I could hear the reverb as it made an angry sound. He set off for the back of the house then, not a particularly long walk, but he didn't seem to want to make it. When he got to the throng of people, he started shouting at them to be quiet. Randy had come to the same conclusion I had. He thought this was a big joke, a flash mob, or maybe even something set up by Mark, and he was not amused. I watched from the stage as his shouts became confused chuckles, his chuckles becoming guffaws, and then it was all over for poor Randy. He stumbled into the mob, grinning and laughing, and his laughs were soon consumed by that tide of laughter. That's when they started moving forward. The crowd was up now, scenting danger, but the strained group blocked the exit. They could do little but watch as the shuffling mass crept forward. They seemed to float as they came, sweeping slowly towards the crowd that had congregated near the stage. Some drunk let fly with a pitcher of PBR, the pitcher spilling as it flew end over end. But if the crowd was slowed by the beer or the heavy glass vessel, they didn't show it. Other men charged them, meaty fists raised, but fell to their knees, laughing before connecting with anything. The group rolled over them, and when they passed, there was no longer anyone on the ground. The closer they got, the less I felt like I saw any of them. As the barflies began to chuckle, their knees shaking and their fists pounding their chests, the more my feet began to drive me towards the back of the stage. The group was made of human-shaped creatures. Their features were dark and undulating, their mouths laughing, white teeth smiling as their eyeless faces bobbed with mirthless laughter. Those who were absorbed by them were never seen again. Those who were absorbed by them never stopped laughing. When my back smacked against the wall, I knew I was out of places to retreat. The fabric curtain that covered that wall felt soft under my sweaty hands, and it was only then that I realized I was still holding the mic. I let it drop, the feedback yarking angrily, but I hardly noticed amidst the din of emotionless laughter. The tone never rose, never fell, just remained at the same level of soulless noise as it drove ice picks into my skull. I closed my eyes, sinking to my backside and covering my ears with my hands as the mask came up to the edge of the stage. When the overhead light hit it, the mask recoiled, and the laughter sounded like tortured screams with a thin veneer of hilarity. It sounded like the laughter that comes creeping out of the windows of an insane asylum. It sounded like the laughter one hears in hell. I closed my eyes and prepared to be consumed. I knew that I, too, would begin to laugh any minute. I would be hopeless to resist. I would simply start to chuckle, start to guffaw, and before I knew it, I would be running to them. I would gladly join the throngs of laughing fools if it meant an end to this hell. I was standing alone outside the joke, and even now in my terror, I longed to be part of it. I don't know how long I sat there with my hands over my ears. One minute the world was a sea of robotic laughter. The next, it was simply gone. I lifted my head to find the bar's back room completely empty. The other three comedians, Mark, Randy, the audience, they were all gone. I was the only one left, the only one not laughing. And when I left the bar, the owner watched me go with some confusion. I never came back again. I knew I couldn't stand on that stage, not after what I had seen, and I certainly couldn't tell jokes again as I thought about the grinning audience of living darkness. Turns out, that was the first of many retreats that night. Over the next few weeks, I saw the audience again and again. They were in the grocery store as I checked out. They were outside the bus as I rode it to work, standing outside the bus stop and looking at me with their eyeless faces. The night they were at the foot of my bed, I knew I had to leave. I packed up everything that mattered to me, got in my car, and drove until I ran out of miles or ran out of money. Turns out, the money came first. I ran out of gas next to a little motel that needed a desk clerk. I've been handling that desk for the last 2 years. I'm pretty good at my job. I make the guests laugh. I'm always at work on time since I live on the premises, and I can eat anything I want from the hotel kitchen as long as I don't go too crazy. I found friends in this little town. Not the same as the ones I had, but they're good people. They tell me often that I should be a comedian. I tell them that in another life, I was. When I go to sleep, I get to live that other life and listen to the chuckling crowd as it drags itself closer and closer to my stage. I always wake up before they get me. I hope they never do. Frank sat on the front row as people filed into the little church. The tears ran nakedly down his face as the cheap organ played Baptist hymns off-key in the background. Somehow this infuriated him. He had paid a lot of money for his wife's funeral, and the least they could do was have tuned the organ before the service. It wasn't even that it was severely off-tune, only slightly. It was just enough to make the discord jangle against his frayed nerves, though. Derek, his son, didn't even seem to notice. He just sat beside him, dutiful as ever, and clutched his father's hand as the sea of mourners wafted past. The mourners. They were the other discord that jangled against his nerves. Ellen had been a school teacher, an English teacher for 30 years, and the crowd was mostly made of old students. Unknown faces, unasked-for condolences, and always on and on about how good a teacher she'd been, or how great it had been to be in her class. Frank couldn't help but notice that for every woman that clasped his hand, there were 2 or 3 young men who were tear-stricken as they passed, bemoaning the death of their beloved teacher. He never said a word, only nodded as Derek thanked them, but deep down, he couldn't keep the questions from rearing up. How many of these young men had she touched in a more intimate fashion than through education. He tried to push the thoughts away, but they just wouldn't go. Ellen had loved him since they first met when they were 17, but after the age of 35, their sex life had begun to wither. She just hadn't been attracted to him the same way. And who could blame her? She had taken the baby weight off after Derek was born with incredible ease, but Frank only seemed to get heavier. By 30, his hair had begun to fall out, and the gray that threaded through what was left made him feel old. By 35, Frank looked like a man on the cusp of 50, and was often mistaken for Derek's grandfather. He laughed these comments off, but it certainly made him feel self-conscious. On the other hand, Ellen still looked like a girl in her 20s, barely older than her students. People always commented on how vibrant she looked, how full of life, and Ellen drank these comments in like manna. That was when Frank began to notice some small signs that his wife might not be faithful. She would meet students out in the wild, and he would see her lingering looks, the touches that lasted a little too long, the thinly veiled flirtation. He had brushed it aside as harmless. She was a teacher. There was no way she could be sleeping with her students. Then, just a week ago, he had received a call at work that changed his life forever. The nurse in the ER informed him that Ellen was dead. One of her students, an 18-year-old Adonis who would have put a Calvin Klein model to shame, had brought her to the emergency room after she'd suffered a major heart attack. She was dead before she got there, but the strange thing was that the boy wouldn't tell them what they'd been doing before the heart attack. He claimed it had happened at school, but she had been dressed poorly when she arrived. Her wedding band was also missing. The boy had the temerity to still be there when Frank had arrived. His condolences had been met with agitation and confusion. He had accepted Frank's impotent shoves, and when Frank had left much later, he had been gone. Now here he was in a coal gray suit, a look of most profound sorrow worn across his face. "Mr. Flossie, I'm deeply sorry for your loss. Mrs. Flossie was a rare gift," he said, shaking Frank's hand and looking wetly at him. Frank didn't have the mental energy to rail at him, and Derek thanked him before the boy went to seat himself. "Dad, if you don't think you can give the eulogy, it's okay," Derek said softly. "I can just give it for you, as long as you have your notes." "I can do it," his father intoned, nodding at a mousy young girl who tried to hug him, but seemed unsure. Ellen had always wanted Frank to give her eulogy if she died first, and Frank felt it was his sacred duty to fulfill her wishes. He would stand on that stage for the woman he loved, and tell them of that love. He would stand up there, cuckold's horns and all, and tell these ingrates about his great love for Ellen. It didn't matter that she had been distant. It didn't matter that she hadn't returned his love for the better part of a decade. He would tell them all of his great love, and they would know how tawdry her regard for them had been. As that damnable organ stopped playing, Frank heard the crowd's low murmur die away to a buzz. The pastor approached the mic then, and thanked them all for coming. He talked about how much of an honor it had been to have Ellen as a member of his congregation. He spoke about her works with the church, and how she had never shirked her duties to God. She had been a Sunday school teacher for 2 decades, and her middle and high school congregants had always been happy to see Miss Ellen's smiling face. He talked about her time spent as a teacher, 30 years of teaching high school English, and the multitudes that she had touched in that time. He spoke on those left behind, her husband Frank and her son Derek. He talked about those who had gone before her mother and father the previous year in a car crash, her sister 15 years ago from a brain aneurysm. He was sure that they were having a joyous reunion in heaven, even as those left behind to mourn the passing of such a wonderful woman wept. Frank was no longer sure of any such thing. The Bible had very clear ideas about adultery, but he hoped that maybe it was so. The thought of Ellen burning in hell made him feel the same way that he had felt when he realized she was likely sleeping with her students. Sick to his stomach, and sick to his heart. She had been his love, his only love, and he wanted to see her again when he passed on. He was no longer sure he would be given such an opportunity. When he realized the pastor was looking at him, had asked if he wanted to say some words for Ellen, he saw that those around him had begun to look at him. Derek had started to rise, figuring his father was in too great of pain to give the eulogy, but Frank lifted himself and put a hand on his son's shoulder. Even if he had been dying, he would have used his last breath to give this eulogy. He walked up the aisle, a very similar aisle to the one he had looked down as Ellen walked to him in her white dress so many years ago, and mounted the stage. As he looked out over the sea of young faces, he caught sight of something lurking near the back of the hall, and it made him shiver. The church was a sea of light, the pews sitting like islands in the swelling ocean of brightness. Near the back, though, under the second-story balcony, lay 4 massive pillars. In the shadows surrounding them appeared to be a group of people. They were numerous, maybe 30 or 40 deep as they clustered in the shadows, and Frank found himself thinking that they had brought that shadow with them. Weren't there lights back there? He should be able to see them, shouldn't he? Why didn't they come sit with the others? As the hush lingered on, and Frank did nothing but stand behind the podium in silence, he became self-conscious and put the crowd out of his mind. Ellen was a wonderful woman, he began, his voice cracking a little. She was a loving wife, a loving mother, and the light of my life. Frank could hear a quiet riffling of noise from the shadows near the back. It almost sounded like a low chuckle. When we met, we were both in high school, as many of you seated here are. Ellen was so vibrant and full of life that I never thought she would notice someone like me. When she came to sit with me one day, talking to someone like me and hanging on my every word, I felt like God had blessed me with her presence. The riffling was definitely a chuckle, a low, throaty surge of almost canned laughter. Some of those seated had turned to glance at the shadowy mob. The mob stood in tight rows, eyes on Frank as he spoke his heart. Frank felt that he could feel their smiles as they leered at him. Who were they? Were they from school? Why were they laughing at such a time as this? When we wed, I was only 18, and I could barely afford a ring. I scraped enough money together for a shoddy engagement band, wanting to propose before she came to her senses, and realized she was too good for me. The crowd chuckled at this, understanding it was a joke, but the crowd in the back erupted into that tinny, canned laughter that so often accompanies sitcoms. The sound made Frank's skin crawl. She was my only love, and I was hers. The canned laughter hit a spike momentarily, and Frank felt his anger rising as the crowd mocked him. Hey, all of you in the back, this is a damn funeral. I don't know what you think you're doing, but this ain't the place. The mourners were turning in their seats to look at the crowd. To Frank's horror, some of them had begun to snicker as well. The row closest to the pillars was now full of smiling individuals, trying to be polite, but failing to suppress their grins or giggles. A redhead near the middle, a girl who couldn't be more than 16, was covering her mouth with her hands as her neighbor leaned forward to try to stifle his own rising mirth. The row ahead of them glowered at them, but Frank could see certain individuals having trouble holding it together. This seemed to spur Frank on, his anger making his face red. Shut up! Just shut the hell up! None of you deserve to be here. You were part of the problem. My Ellen loved me. We were soulmates, and... The second row from the back had burst into the same mechanical laughter he'd heard at the start. Their individual laughters, hearty guffaws, embarrassed titters, were replaced by sitcom drones. The sound made Frank feel like he was crazy. The sheer unrealness of the situation, a funeral full of laughter, made him feel ready for the nut house. The laughter was like nails on a chalkboard. It grated against his psyche and made him feel like laughing and crying all at once. The laughter was the kind you hear in an insane asylum. The kind of laughter you heard in hell. Stop it! Stop it! Stop laughing at me! My wife is dead, and you people are sitting here laughing at me! Frank was crying now, big ugly drops rolling down his doughy face. Despite her infidelity, he had loved her, and here these people were, on the worst day of his life, mocking him with laughter that wasn't even theirs. The laughter had spread to the halfway point of the pews. Some of the people in the church, the ones not yet affected, had begun to edge towards the front as though the laughter might be contagious. They moved to the fire exits and windows, frantically looking for an escape, but no escape would come. And with the crowd of shadows guarding the rear exit, they were trapped. "It's your fault," Frank railed at them. "It's all your fault. I loved her. I loved her so much. But how was I supposed to compete with an endless supply of high school boys? How was I supposed to compete with your perfect bodies and constant attention? You drove her from me. You ruined our perfect marriage. You... Frank's tears streaked down his face as he found his son. Derek's face was racked with uncontrollable laughter. As he cast about, Frank could see others in the throes of that inescapable mirth. The boy who had brought his wife to the hospital was now doubled up with his head against his knees and a puddle of vomit on the floor in front of him. His handsome face was red and sweaty, his mouth laughing, but his eyes screaming. Others had fallen into the aisle, their bodies racking as they tried to draw breath amidst the laughter. Even those who tried to escape laughed, their fingers clawing at the doors, their hands banging against the windows, their bodies convulsing with alien mirth. On his knees, the pastor doubled up with uncontrollable giggles as he gasped for air and shook violently. Frank heard people retching, people falling, people kicking their legs and thrashing their arms in uncontrolled spasms, and as they laughed their lives away, the darkness spread. From his vantage point, Frank could see the darkness spreading out from the pillars. Some of those laughing were taken by it, their bodies becoming shapeless in the gathering gloom. It negated the light that usually filled the church. It negated the warmth and sanctity he had always felt there. Frank ducked and put his back to the podium when the darkness came for him. No, they wouldn't have him. This was their fault. It was all their fault. They had tempted his wife. They had ruined her. They had... Frank felt a snort escape his nose as he covered his mouth with his hands. His wife was dead. His life would never be the same. As the belly laugh bubbled up inside him, though, Frank realized too late what the rest had already discovered as he stood talking. He spent the last few moments of his life laughing into his palms. "Hey, Four Eyes," Marcus yelled, and I winced as I heard his sneakers smacking the linoleum. Marcus and I are far from friends. I've known Marcus since my family moved here when I was 8. My first interaction with him was on the playground on my first day of school. Marcus and his small band of cronies wandered up to me as I sat in the sandbox, clearly drawn over by the new kid, and made the dynamic of our future relationship very clear. I had sand kicked in my face, a sneaker pressed to my chest, and before I knew it, I was on my back in the sandbox, as Marcus informed me that he would be collecting my lunch money from now on, and there wasn't a thing I could do about it. As I lay there staring up at him, without a teacher in sight to help me, I knew at 8 that I was truly helpless. For the next 8 years, I brought my lunch. For the next 8 years, he took this as a personal challenge to make my life a living hell. My lunches were stolen, my glasses were broken, my things were vandalized, and my friends and I were tormented by the ever-present shadow of Marcus Hines. I did make friends, of course, but many people avoided me simply because I had elicited the ire of Marcus. He was a constant presence in my life. He was always there, always looming, always waiting for his next opportunity to show me what I was, his constant victim. I never owned anything that he didn't try to destroy or take away from me. I never liked a girl that he didn't immediately woo and dump in a semester. Marcus made it his business to have anything that I wanted but couldn't afford, so he could rub it in my face. I kept hoping, just as Mother had always taught me, that karma would catch up with him, and his actions would be punished by the ever-present force of cosmic justice. It seemed, however, that karma was not on my side. As we grew, Marcus became the darling of whatever school he attended, and I became known as a bit of a weirdo. I was a quiet kid. I liked to write. My grades were fine, but I was an introvert, and I didn't like to show off in class. Marcus, on the other hand, was known and loved by all. I quickly learned that this was how he got away with his bullying. Marcus was large, imposing, but he had a way about him that endeared him to adults. I would never admit it to him, but he was also smart. He never had trouble with grades, never had to study for tests, and seemed to succeed with only minimal effort. He played sports through school and thrived on the field just as much as he did in the classroom. By the time we were seniors, he had a football scholarship that would let him go to nearly any school he wanted. He was a typical all-American student, and the world was his oyster. I hated him, especially after what he did to me. I had spent 3 years with one goal in mind, having a seat on the student council at my senior year. It would look great on my college transcripts, alongside my volunteer work and debate team presence. Also, I thought I could actually make a difference for some of the unheard students at the school. On a deeper level, I realized it might also bring me out of my shell and change me a little before leaving this whole experience behind and going on to college. I had lived my life as an introvert, not really wanting to know anyone outside my circle of friends. Senior year was my chance to really experience what would become the best years of my life, or so they said. Maybe putting myself out there would change me a little, perhaps even for the better. I had such high hopes back then. I had campaigned, talked to a few of my fellow students, and felt that I had my finger on the pulse of what they wanted in a councilman. I seemed a shoo-in for the empty seat. That wasn't until Marcus realized how much I wanted it. That's when he joined the race. Suddenly, his flyers were in every hall, his posters plastered over mine. His talking points were very similar to mine too, and his platform was nearly identical to my own. He could say what he wanted to his constituents, but his goal seemed to be yet again taking the one thing that I wanted. He'd been trying and failing to throw me off my game for weeks, trying to get in my head and make me drop out of the election before the upcoming candidacy speech, before the student body voted for their representation. As he approached, I wondered if he had found the toehold he needed. I closed my laptop as he came to stand over me, not wanting it broken if he was in a mood to break things. His face was possessed of that mixture of wicked glee and childish meanness. He looked like a kid who was about to pull the wings off a butterfly. I guess he was. I had been his caged bug for years, and today was just another chance to practice his sadism on me. He came alone, but I could see several Letterman jackets hovering nearby, watching the show. I was nowhere near as muscular as him, being on the scrawny side, but that hardly mattered to me. Marcus never fought fair if he could help it. "Guess what I did last night?" he shouted, glancing around to see who was watching. My friends, immersed in a game of Magic the Gathering, looked up like startled animals around a watering hole. A predator had arrived, and they wanted to know when the best time to start running would be. "I don't know, Marcus. Something fulfilling and meaningful, but I doubt it," I said, without much interest. Marcus barked out a sarcastic little laugh. "You'd be right there, Four Eyes." He never used my name. It was always Four Eyes, and always in tones of deepest scorn. I was at a rager last night when I met this fine-looking piece of tail and took her upstairs for a few hours. God, she screamed so loud I thought the cops were going to come. "If you're looking for a high five, I think your boys are hovering somewhere over there," I said, already uninterested in the conversation. I had no idea that his trap had teeth, and he was about to show me just how deep they could cut. "I just thought I'd let you know what a good lay your sister was, Four Eyes." She screamed my name again and again as I had her. The whole cafeteria was paying attention now. I glanced at my friends and saw that their game was forgotten as Marcus laid out his night's activities for me in intimate details. My face reddened, the snickers already beginning, and he loudly proclaimed his activities for all to hear. I was shocked. I was incapable of reacting. I simply wanted to stop existing at that very moment. How could she? How could my own flesh and blood betray me so thoroughly? How many nights had I confided in my family about the abuse I suffered at Marcus's hands? How many times had she seen me demoralized at school by this bully? How could she have done such a thing? I don't know how his story ended. I grabbed my bag and ran into the cafeteria, hiding my streaming eyes as I ran blindly for the exit. Someone yelled at me in the hallway, but I didn't stop. I was outside far sooner than I thought I would be, and I heard a car horn blare as I dashed across the parking lot towards my car. I tossed my bag inside, not even caring about the things inside, and was on the road before I knew quite what was happening. My streaming eyes made it difficult to drive, but I knew I couldn't stay there a moment longer. The emotions roiled inside me, and I felt like I might be sick as I drove the streets. There was rage bubbling inside me, an impotent rage that had been festering for years, but had never been fully realized. I hated Marcus, but his actions had been those of a bully, seeking a release until this point. It was only then that I realized his intention to hurt. He wasn't content with just hurting me physically anymore. He wanted to break me. I didn't understand his animosity, and I never would. I spent the rest of the day in my room, having a nervous breakdown. My friends didn't text me. No one texted me. As I lay there waiting for someone to reach out to me, I began to feel utterly alone. My anxiety was palpable as I lay in my bed and tried to gain control of myself. Had anyone even noticed I left school? Of course they had. They were just too embarrassed by my outburst to contact me. They didn't want to get caught up in the fallout of my shame. I wouldn't be welcome to sit with my friends anymore. I would be an outcast. My brain reminded me, almost absently, that I could kiss my bid for student council goodbye as well. No one would vote for me now. No one would waste their vote on a loser like me. The candidacy speech was tomorrow. How could I mount that stage with everyone whispering about me? How could I tell them how I would be their voice on the council, with them all laughing at me behind their hands? My mind raced, my pulse raced, and I lay in bed in perpetual anxiety. I must have fallen asleep at some point, my anxiety so bad that I had worn myself out because of it. Because the next thing I knew, someone was knocking on my door. "Hey, Spaz, why'd you leave school?" My blood ran cold. It was her. My sister, Stephanie, was never what you would call a joy. She was 2 years younger than me, a sophomore, but the two of us couldn't have been more different. My sister was the foil to my introvert nature. She was a social butterfly who flew in many circles and knew practically everyone. She was their perfect little girl to my parents. They were utterly unaware of her late-night carousing and extracurricular activities. To them, she was an angel, but to me, she was just a spoiled brat. She was needy to the point of annoyance, her needs turning to indifference when you needed something from her. She had come by to see what she could gain from my suffering. "Go away," I droned, not wanting to see her. She came in instead. Heard Marcus spilled the beans about our night last night. I turned towards the wall, ignoring her. It was just sex. It's not like we're dating or anything. He's cute and I wanted to sleep with him. I turned over angrily to growl at her. "You slept with someone who has made my life a living hell since I was 8 years old. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel? You've made me into a laughingstock. How can I go back to school and look at Marcus, knowing that he's been with my freaking sister?" She smirked, not even having the decency to look ashamed. "As if anyone but you cares. Get over yourself. It's my life, and I'll live it any way I want. For the record, he was great too." She added the last barb before leaving. My mother was furious when she came home from work. Not at my sister, of course. She couldn't believe that people would spread such lies about her perfect little angel. She was furious at me. How could I leave school early? What was I thinking? Didn't I care about my future at all? Skipping classes and being truant was no way to live my life. The sermons went on and on as we sat around the dinner table. My sister was smug, of course, as I sat there being chastised. Dad went right on eating as though the world were just as bland as it always was. To say that Dad didn't care was an understatement. Dad simply didn't want to involve himself in what he called woman's work, and didn't worry his mind about the matters concerning the children. I had started shoveling my food down, barely tasting it, to escape the table and my mother's howling words. With my plate clean, I asked to leave. She wasn't done yelling at me yet, but I told her that I needed to prepare my speech for tomorrow, which seemed to perk her up a little. She had known that I was running. Hadn't they both told me how small a chance someone like me had of being elected? But as I kept at it, I think she realized how much I wanted this. She released me, threatening bodily harm if she ever heard of me leaving school early again, and I was free to return to my room. I spent the rest of the night in a state of anxious tension. A rainstorm rolled in about midnight, and I found myself tossing and turning in a ball of roiling emotions. I didn't dare go to school tomorrow. Marcus would be waiting there. All those people would know about my shame, and they would all laugh at me. I couldn't go back. I couldn't go back. I couldn't. The lightning lit up the sky, and I started out of my bed, looking at the window. Had I seen something? It was impossible. I was on the second story. There was no way I had seen something at my window. My anxiety was creeping up on me now, and it was making me see things, that was all. As the rain came down, I got up and moved closer to the window. The thunder boomed outside, and I crept towards the glass square like a rat trying to avoid detection. There was nothing there. Why was I so jumpy? There was nothing on the other side of the window, but when the lightning flashed again, I screamed and fell onto the carpet. Something was on the other side of the window. an inky face that had been looking at me, and when it saw me looking, it had smiled. Its teeth had been Colgate white, a stark contrast to its midnight personage, and I felt my breath hitching as I stared at that jet-black window. The rain fell against it like angry stones, and I waited in terror for the next flash of lightning. When it flashed, it was gone, though. I curled into a ball on the floor, closing my eyes and trying to will myself to sleep, but all I could see was the nightmare face. I had seen it for the barest of seconds, but it was imposed on my memories forever. I lay on the floor as the lightning struck outside, too afraid to open my eyes, but too scared to sleep either. My anxiety and fear roiled inside me like a tempest, and I spent the rest of the night huddled on the floor, shuddering. Wake up! I must have dozed off sometime before the sun came up. My mother was standing over me, yelling and slapping at me as the sun shone merrily through the window. My mother was rousing me, telling me I was going to be late. I stirred groggily and went to my closet to get out the clothes I would wear for the speech today. I was too groggy for the anxiety to hit me all at once, but as I started getting dressed, I remembered the roiling pit of dread in my stomach and stopped with my slacks halfway up. I couldn't go to school. I'd have to face the mob alone. My mother came in with a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs, frowning as she saw me shaking and indecisive. All my excuses, though, fell on deaf ears. I was not missing school today, no matter what was wrong, and that was that. She would take me and drop me off herself if it came to it. I was not ruining my education because of something silly that had happened the day before. People would always be stupid, and I wasn't going to ruin my future over it. In the end, I took the cup of coffee and left just to escape her venom. As I drove, I honestly felt like I might be having a nervous breakdown. The coffee shook in my hand, and if Mom hadn't put it in a to-go cup, I would have undoubtedly spilled it on my pants as I drove. I looked up in time to see the light turn red, slamming on my brakes just a minute too late and getting a nasty look from a jogger running across the road. I tracked her dully with my eyes and jumped when she ran past an overhang near the deli. The coffee flew out of my hand and hit the passenger window, exploding in a caffeine puddle over the glass. The passers-by looked at me concerned as the drops slid down the glass, but I was already running the red light and speeding towards the school. My heart raced and my stomach flipped over, my anxiety about the speech and the bully momentarily forgotten. Under the awning, perched in the shadow, had been two of those oily black things that had appeared in my window the night before. Their skin had oozed with midnight clarity, but their smiles were wide and crazed. As I drove, I thought I could see others, pairs and threesomes, foursomes, all watching me from the shadows of alleys and the dark respites of awnings and doorways. They were following me. They wanted me, but I did not want to be found by them. I had reminded myself not to speed. I had to remind myself to stop at stop signs and red lights. I did not want to be pulled over. I did not want to stop until I was somewhere with people and lights and places to hide from them. At that point, I would have welcomed the jeers of my schoolyard rabble. I pulled into the parking lot just as the first bell rang. The halls were packed, the students making last-minute preparations and finishing their conversations around lockers. But when they recognized me, I heard a definite change in the tempo of the conversations. "Oh my God, isn't his sister the one who... I feel so bad for him. I don't know how he came to school after... Oh man, Marcus totally owned his ass yesterday. Told the whole world his sister's a... And he just ran away." I walked fast, not talking, not stopping, just wanting to get to my homeroom amidst the gale of gossip. I heard someone laugh, but I didn't dare look. It sounded fake anyway, like teasing laughter. More like the canned laughter on TV shows than real laughter. The hallway became a gauntlet, people staring, people laughing. Amongst them, I became sure that I could see those black creatures that had hounded me all the way here. They slipped among them, staying in the shadows, and whoever they touched seemed to smile and titter. I wanted to run. I could feel tears on the verge of breaking the surface, but I didn't want to draw more attention. The laughter was so snide, so fake, that I almost couldn't stand it. It rattled against my nerves, and it made me want to scream. I rounded a corner, still making for my homeroom, and bumped into someone. I threw my hands up defensively, almost certain that it would be one of those tar creatures with their smiling mouths. Instead, it was Miss Cunningham, the assistant principal. She looked put upon, her normally well-maintained pantsuit and lustrous black hair looking rumpled and out of place. I wondered if she, too, hadn't slept well last night. She huffed when she realized who she had run into, and tapped her foot impatiently. "I was beginning to think you weren't coming today. You're speaking second. Marcus was on time, so he gets to speak first, and it starts in 5 minutes. I suggest you hurry." She turned and started for the gymnasium. I could hear that repulsive laughter behind me, heard it creeping up the corridors like a cancerous cloud, and I sped off behind her, not wanting it to catch me. The gym was packed. The entire senior class was assembled. Any excuse to miss first period, I supposed, and they were murmuring quietly on the hard bleachers that had been pulled out for the occasion. As I came in, someone noticed me, and the whispering conversations began again. I heard some snickers, felt their stares, and knew that they knew my shame. My stomach was a roil of angry emotions. My brain was befuddled and unsure of what was real anymore. I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, my whole life hanging by a fiber before entirely imploding. I had no clue how much worse it could get. "About time you showed up, Four Eyes," Marcus said, looking resplendent in a suit and tie that had clearly been tailored for him. I didn't say anything. My attention was on the crowd. I could see the creatures amongst them, whispering and gnashing those perfect teeth against their ears. Some in the back had begun to chuckle. Some had already started laughing. Those further down were still engaged in their own conversations, unaware of what horror lurked behind them. They just sat in their little peer circles, chatting and living their lives free of the overwhelming stress surrounding me like a cloud. How I envied them. "Look at all the voters you're not going to get, Four Eyes," Marcus said, but I continued to ignore him. As Miss Cunningham mounted the stage, the laughter had already begun in the back. She ignored it, opened the proceedings with a little speech before introducing Marcus to scattered applause. Marcus grinned at me, mouthing that I should watch how it's done before mounting the podium and starting his speech. He got straight to the point. Students wanted more free periods and fewer assemblies that served no purpose. They wanted more pep rallies and car washes, and less information about booster meetings and boring stuff. He said nothing, but he said it well, and he kept it short, so the students would remember it. The applause were scattered again. The laughter in the top row was taking on that mechanical sound that made my sanity scream from the depths of my skull. There were more of them now, the house lights dimming in the dark of the upper bleachers, and the darkness was spreading. Miss Cunningham had to call my name several times before I finally stood up and made my way to the podium. Marcus's grinning face welcomed me from the front row, smiling and inviting me to begin my pathetic speech. I had forgotten my papers, my meticulously crafted note cards, but it hardly mattered. I could no more have read them at this point than I could have spoken Russian. From the podium, I could see the black tar monsters crawling over the crowd, working their way down and bringing the inky darkness with them. The student body needs a person who will represent them, represent their interests on the council. I feel that I heard the rattling of stuttered laughter, and it threw me off even worse. I feel that I can. My eyes were as big as dinner plates. They were smiling at me from within the crowd. Their two white teeth were horrifying. Their teeth, too large for their mouths. How did they contain all those teeth? How did they... Mrs. Cunningham was walking towards me, and I'm not sure if she was trying to save me from the shame of making a fool of myself on stage, or she was angry that I had wasted her time. Regardless, she only got about halfway across the stage when she smirked and began to chuckle. I watched her, terror written across my face, as she doubled over and began to erupt in racking gales of full-body laughter. There was laughter behind me, too. The torpor was becoming a single note of canned and emotionless chuckles as it spilled from throats that were no longer their own. I glanced to the side and saw Marcus doubling up, his fingers dragging over his eyes and cheeks and leaving bloody tails behind. The mob was laughing, their laughter dead in uniform, and I felt my sanity unraveling a strand at a time as I backed away from the crowd. My foot found empty air, and I felt the wind knocked out of me as I fell off the stage. Miss Cunningham was tearing at her clothes as she laughed her life away. I scooted backwards, getting my feet under me and running as that terrible laughter chased me. It's the kind of laughter you hear bubbling from the windows of an insane asylum. It's the kind of laughter you hear in hell. I ran then, ran until I found a door and barreled through it as the maniac drone chased after me. I ran until the school doors opened before me and I was out on the quad, my sneakers making for home. I ran and I ran, the pavement the most substantial thing I'd felt all day. I ran until I found myself on the porch of my house. I banged on the door until my mother opened it, confusion and anger stamped big across her face. Then I collapsed, and I didn't come back to reality for 3 days. When I did, I was in the hospital. That's where I got the whole story from my bleary-eyed mother, who hadn't left my bedside the entire time I'd been here. Everyone in the gym was dead. The police were calling it a gas leak, and the whole city was mourning the loss of so many young people. The doors had been wedged shut, all but the ones I had burst out of. School officials had found everyone inside dead from hyperventilation, including Miss Cunningham. Some had tried to claw their eyes out, had peeled their faces open, but all had succumbed to this terrible tragedy. I said nothing. My sister came to visit, apologizing for how she had hurt me, and extremely thankful that I had been late that day. My mother was suddenly the doting woman I had always wanted. She and my sister were never far from my side, and their attention quickly became claustrophobic. I soaked it in as long as it lasted, though, never wanting it to end. I would never tell anyone about what had happened that day. They all assumed that my lateness had led to my safety, and they would never believe me if I told them the truth. That was 10 years ago. I live on my own now. I have it all. An apartment, a girlfriend, a mediocre job, the whole experience. My mom and sister still call to check on me often. My dad is the same old ambivalent person he always has been, and it's heartwarming to have their love after years of feeling like an outcast in my own home. I felt I had gotten over the event. I felt that I had put it behind me. I don't talk about it outside of therapy, and I like to think that it may make me stronger for having lived through it. My girlfriend knows nothing about it, of course. She knows I had something traumatic happen in my past, but she knows I've moved on, and the less I say about it, the better it is for my mental health. At least, I had gotten over it. Yesterday I received a letter in the mail, a letter from my old high school, a letter for a high school reunion. I looked at the postcard, a glossy picture on the front, and the words on the back with the banner proclaiming, "Welcome back, class of 2010. The front was a picture of the gym as it had been on the day of the event. On the floor was gathered the smiling creatures as they waved and grinned their eternal grins. On the back was written 3 words that sent chills down my spine even now. See you soon. Be advised, ye who enter here. The crowd had been buzzing like a swarm of anxious insects, but as the deep, resonant voice spilled over them, they quieted. This is a horror fiction live show. The crowd was a-twitter with restless legs and barely contained whispers. The venue, an old playhouse that stood for another few days, was the perfect locale for this year's Halloween show. The building had a rich history of hauntings, strange activity, and a dark past that would make the ambience all the spookier. Shelley was happy that they had secured the place. The owner had seemed surprised that she wanted to use it, and they had taken relatively little to rent it. As Tobias sat on stage, Cindy on his left and Lucius on his right, the crowd sat anxiously before them. Shelley knew this was going to be a show to remember. Those with weak constitutions or questionable mental states should be advised to proceed at their own risk. The crowd began to cheer, and Shelley saw a runner of dust shifting from the rafters. Hopefully this old place wouldn't collapse in on them. You have been warned. To those who remain, brace yourself for the Sleepless Nights Horror Podcast. The applause were deafening, and Shelley knew there would be some serious editing in post to make sure that it was usable. She saw some trails of dust wafting from the ceiling as the cheers escalated, and thought about how the structural integrity of this place was likely to be poor. They had placed 500 of the show's closest fans in the rickety seats in the main showroom, and the gas lamps lit the scene in a ghostly way that couldn't be fabricated. The chandelier overhead was lit by 1,000 real candles, the effort of an hour or more, but it cast the second glow over the room that would only add to the ambience. "Make sure you keep a steady shot over the crowd," she told the cameraman quietly, and he gave her a thumbs up as he swept the crowd. When the network saw this, it would be impossible for them to refuse their proposal. The Sleepless Nights Horror Podcast was the third most popular horror podcast on Stitcher, the fifth most listened to on Spotify, and had over 1 million fans worldwide. The show had been steadily rising in the ranks, but its numbers had stagnated a few months ago. People were only so interested in scary story podcasts, and the production team had been looking for ways to boost the listeners. They had tried the usual hooks, giveaways, collaborations, longer episodes, but nothing seemed to be working. That was when Creepshow had approached them. Creepshow was an online network that streamed horror content and provided a platform for horror creators. They had been turned down by other narrators and had finally come to see if they could secure the voice and story talent of the Sleepless Nights Horror Podcast. They had wanted a test tape, something they could send to their backers to prove the show belonged on the network. Thus, here they were, shooting a Halloween episode in this abandoned theater. The showing had been good, 500 screaming fans, and Tobias's sultry voice moving among them like a cloud of death, infecting them all with excitement. Welcome to the show, folks. I'm your host, Tobias Mons, and I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. If you're listening from home, then let me just say you're missing a truly creepy experience. We're coming to you live from the Sheridan Theater. This theater has played host to not only many of the greatest musical talents of the last 30 years, but also a host of grisly murders and suicide. The blood has run thick between the boards of this old building, and where better to tell our spooky tales tonight than right here? The audience quieted, settling in for the start of the show. The cameras panned over the crowd of expectant 20-somethings as they spoke in a hush. Shelley glanced over the crowd and had to do a double take when she saw someone standing in the center aisle. She was a lithe little thing, wearing something like a zombie costume, walking up the center stage. Her long, dark hair swayed as she came, and Shelby couldn't help but sigh as she thought, crazed fan. Shelby got on the radio to call security to intercept her, but when she glanced back, the girl was gone. Shelley scanned the crowd and found that no one even looked close to the way the girl had. She put it out of her mind as Tobias started his first story. Our first tale is about a man with a dream. He wants to be a ventriloquist, but the dummy he finds is anything but helpful. Submitted for your approval, I give you Wooden Nickel. As he began the story about a possessed puppet, Shelby looked down at the camera display sitting before her. The booth was set up in one of the balconies that overlooked the stage and seats. Each of the other balconies held cameras that caught the scene below from a different angle, and by the end, they would have 3 or 4 different views of the stage. They would edit everything together later, and the results would give them something cool to send to Creepshow. As she watched the camera feeds, one of the upper balcony lights began to wink, casting a flickering eyesore over the stage. Shelley glanced at the upper balcony and saw the can flickering as it hung from the railing. She had the walkie to her lips, trying to route someone up there, when she saw a murky shadow skulking up on the landing in the inky blackness. What the hell was going on up there? Those landings were supposed to be closed off. Some rogue fan would ruin this taping for them, and she took off for the stairs to see who was mucking around. When she found the padlock still on the door, however, Shelley wrinkled her brow and hesitated as she took it off. When she found the balcony empty, Shelley left in a hurry, locking the door behind her. She came back down to a shouting match in the hallway. Derek was the senior camera tech for the troupe. He was a big guy with a bushy beard and a cap snugged down over his graying hair, and he had been with the show for a while. He was yelling at Cecily, the stage manager, and she came back in time to hear him saying that he was going to leave, and she couldn't stop him. Cecily was in tears. Tears were usually not far from her, and she begged him not to go. Who would run the board? Who would maintain the feeds? I don't care. I told you yesterday this job wasn't worth my life. Ah, yes. Yesterday. They had been setting up all day yesterday, trying to get the wiring in the old theater to cooperate. The old theater had never been intended to run the equipment they were bringing in, and they had run the cables from the van and started setting up nonetheless. Everyone knew the place had a reputation for spooks. It was supposed to be one of the most haunted places in the city. By the end of the day, everyone in the troupe found out it was well-earned, too. It started as things seen out of the corner of the eye. They were things easily ignored, until later when you had time to think about it. Derek had seen something too, and he told Paul and Mark to help him search the building earlier that day. It could be a homeless guy, he said, and we don't want to be jumped on by some meth head while our backs are turned. They spent the first hour searching the building, from attic to basement, but found nothing but an angry cat and some wasps in the rafters. When they gave the crew the all clear, those who hadn't searched milling about the alley next to the theater, everyone got back to work. Shelley would still catch things out of the corner of her eye, though. Shadows, slight movements, but she brushed it all off as nerves. She had grown up hearing stories about this place, and it was only natural that she would be a little nervous here. When they broke for lunch, Paul had already been talking about seeing someone on the theater floor. Everyone told him he was nuts, but he was adamant that he had seen someone down there. I was hanging lights in one of the balconies, and when I looked down, I saw this woman walking towards the stage. She was holding her stomach, staggering like a drunk, but before I could call out to her, she just disappeared. They brushed it off, saying the dust or the lights were playing tricks on him, but after what Shelley had seen earlier, she couldn't help but wonder. Derek's accident had happened near dark. Shelley had been setting up the stage when she heard a loud crash and Derek's bear-like yell. He had fallen into the railing on one of the boxes, the rail cracking and threatening to spill him. He was breathing heavily and looking around frantically as Shelley stood looking at him. He seemed unable to push off the rail, unwilling, and wouldn't move until Shelley and Mark came up there to get him. He was sitting then, shuddering and looking furtively around. He looked terrified. "What happened?" Shelley asked, and when she tried to touch him, he shuddered away from her. "Someone tried to attack me," he stammered, pointing to the shadow area behind the door of the box. "I turned to leave after setting up the cameras, and it was just standing there on the balcony. I thought it was one of you at first, but it weren't right. It was like a person made out of shadows. It was wearing a suit and a hat, smiling this huge, horrible grin. And then it laughed. It burst out of it, and it came towards me. Its laughter sounded like the roar of a wildcat, and when it opened that smiling mouth to try to eat me, I almost fell through the railing as I backed away. When I looked back, I was scared it was going to bite my face, but it was gone." He wouldn't go back in after that. He left for the day, and the three of them had to finish the preparations. It was good and dark by the time they were done, and they were all glad to be gone. None of them had seen any of those inky monsters that he talked about, but they had all seen some weird stuff out of sight. Paul had lost his cell phone, too. He had laid it down on a banister and turned to find it gone. He had given it up as lost, only to find it sitting on the front stoop when they left. Mark swore that he had been pushed, almost tumbling down the stairs, but said it could have just as easily been a loose board as a ghostly hand. Nothing too weird had happened to Shelley, but she made a mental note not to be here by herself. This place just had an aura about it. An aura that was still working on Derek, it seemed. Shelley stepped into the conversation just as Derek was about to storm past Cecily. "What is going on? You two are yelling much too close to the cameras." "I saw it," Derek said, shuddering as Cecily looked blankly at him. Cecily may not have known what he was talking about, but Shelley found herself glancing around. "Where?" "Upper balcony. I saw the lights flashing and looked up to see what the problem was. I saw it up there, staring down at me and smiling. It stared at me for nearly 2 minutes before it just melted away like mist." Shelley shuddered without meaning to. He was describing the balcony that she had been on not 5 minutes ago. "Derek, I need you to go back to your post." Derek bristled. "The hell I will. That thing tried to kill me yesterday, and if tonight goes off without a hitch, none of us will ever need to worry about this kind of crap again. This is a stunt, Derek, a grand gesture to show the network that we mean business. We have an hour left, maybe an hour 30, and we're out the door. I need you to keep it together for that long. Can you do that?" Derek stared at her icily, but finally nodded. "For the show," he breathed. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled over them, Cindy and Lucius providing minor roles when needed. Tobias had always been the show's draw. Tobias had a voice that made people long for the darkest of dark and the worst of the worst. Tobias could tell you how a monster ripped your face off and slaughtered your whole family, and you'd still put it on before bedtime so you could drift off to his sultry voice. Creepshow wanted Tobias. Of that, Shelley had no doubt, and they would get him if she had anything to say about it. When the phantom breeze blew across her ear, she felt herself shudder like a cartoon character. Shelley turned, thinking that Paul or someone was being funny, but there was no one to be seen. That hadn't been an errant breeze, Shelley thought as she put her hand to her ear. As she looked around, Shelley felt she could almost hear a rattling laugh on the breeze, like leaves scuttling across pavement. Someone had blown on her ear, and it had smelled foul, like unbrushed teeth and tobacco. She turned back to the console, a second shudder creeping over the first. This show couldn't be over soon enough. 10 minutes later, the story ended and the audience erupted into applause. I hope you enjoyed that story as much as I did. It's always good to learn that I'm not the only talking head out there. The audience chuckled politely as they murmured amongst themselves. Our next story is about a phone operator who gets a call from someone a little out of their long-distance plan. Led by Lucius Moore, I give you No Name, No Number. Tobias came off stage, and Shelley went down to talk to him. He was leaning against the wall when she got downstairs, Lucius making his way through the story on stage. Shelley could see Tobias's face lit by the ghostly light of his cell phone and the infernal light of the menthol cigarettes he liked. He was smoking, a habit that Shelley had been trying to break him of. She wrinkled her nose as she directed him outside, reaching out to take the cigarette. This place is enough of a death trap without you trying to burn it down, she chided quietly. He rolled his eyes, but followed her out. How's it going out there, she asked when the stage door was shut behind them. Amazing. The crowd loves this. This place. He spread his hands out towards the old building. I can't believe you got a place like this. The ambience and aesthetic are perfect for something like this. I could almost believe it's really haunted. Shelley found herself wishing she believed it a little less, but just nodded along as he continued. Hey, can I make a change for the next story? Shelley raised an eyebrow. We've had the stories listed online for weeks, Tobias. People expect to... Yeah, I know. I want to read all of them, but this story is trending right now, and I think we should read it. It's seasonal, and I think it'll play well. Maybe we can add 15 minutes to the show for it? Shelley made a noise that he must have found familiar, and Tobias laughed. Don't worry. If it bombs, we can cut it for the Creepshow promo. I think it'll do well, though. Shelley sighed and nodded. Okay, Tobias, but tell it last, okay? Maybe it's a special bonus story or something. He smiled. Thanks, boss. You won't regret it. He turned out to be very wrong on that account. She came back in to find Derek waiting for her near the door. I can't stay. It's stalking me. I gotta... Shelley took a long look at Derek. He was rattled. This bear of a man was rattled by something he had seen here. He was looking around squeamishly, fearfully, and Shelley was surprised when she took him by the shoulder and pulled him down to her eye level. Derek, nothing is out to get you. Now I need you to go back to your station and finish your job. But, she drew his face very close to her. Derek, you're perfectly safe. Now let's go. Shelley walked him back up the stairs, and they found Cecily looking frantically for him. I swear I went to the bathroom for 5 minutes, and when I came back he was gone. Keep an eye on him, Shelley told her, pushing him maybe a little harder than she needed to. Do not let him out of your sight. Cecily nodded, taking Derek by the arm and closing him into the little room he was supposed to be monitoring cameras from. Shelley nodded as she heard the door lock behind them and returned to her duties. She went back downstairs, catching the tail end of the second story and the beginning of the third before stepping outside for a smoke. She may hound Tobias to quit, but her vocal cords weren't the one keeping the channel alive. This whole experience was nerve-wracking as hell. She couldn't imagine having to run another one of these. Luckily, Shelley thought, she wouldn't have to worry about that kind of thing after tonight. Someone else would be responsible for these sorts of things, and Shelley could go back to just managing the show. A sound like long nails on slate turned her, and Shelley found herself looking into the eyeless, smiling face of a horror. It stood in the doorway, its body an undulating spot of human-shaped darkness. Shelley felt the cigarette fall from her numb lips as they made eye contact. What eye contact you could make with a creature that lacked eyes. Was this what Derek had seen? Had this thing lunged at her in a dark theater, Shelley would have never set foot on the grounds again. How Derek had talked himself into returning to this place was beyond her. The creature moved ever so subtly, and Shelley watched the door slam shut in her stunned face. She spent the next few minutes yanking on the door, pounding and screaming to be let in. No one answered, though. So she walked around the building, trying doors and yelling at windows. The windows refused to budge, the doors had zero give, and when Shelley tried to call Derek, Cecily, Paul, or anyone else, the calls went straight to voicemail. What the hell was going on in there? Why wouldn't anyone answer her? Surely someone had to hear her with all the noise she was making. When the screaming started, Shelley turned to the building with a cold dread building in her stomach. The screams didn't last long, though. The screams became a kind of laughing as she sat there listening. She called the police. At least she tried to. The police would come. They had to come. They were the people you called for help. They had to come when you called. Shelley didn't know what the police could do against these smiling, shadowy creatures, but she was certain that it would be more than she could. When 911 went straight to voicemail, Shelley knew that this was something different. That's when she remembered the stream. Maybe if she could bring it up, Shelley could find out what was going on inside. If nothing else, maybe she could find some way to fix it. She went to the van and opened her laptop, tapping into the stream easily enough. There was a 10 to 15 minute delay in the video, and perhaps she could use it to see what was happening inside. She saw Lucius finishing his story, and heard the applause as the camera swept to catch Tobias returning to the stage. "Thank you, Lucius. What a great story. We've got a special story for you next. One about a perfect audience who seems like just what this comedian's looking for. It's not that hard to imagine such an audience if I try." The audience laughed, but some of it sounded a little strange as it rolled from her speakers. The cameras panned over them, and Shelley could swear she saw some pockets of darkness amongst the crowd. People-shaped things, like the ones that had closed the door, but they were smiling 2 wide smiles and laughing like loons. This next tale is called The Perfect Audience, and it will be read by yours truly, me. He began the story, and Shelley almost imagined she could hear the door slam in the background. He had just gotten started when Shelley heard the strange, canned laughter crackle from the speakers. It was quiet, background noise, the kind of laughter you hear on a sitcom, but she could hear it under the words as Tobias read on. Someone made a shushing sound, but whoever was laughing seemed to ignore them. The camera was on Tobias as he read, the ambient music they always used playing over the speakers. Shelley could still hear that laughter, though, and she wished the camera would pan over again and give her another look at the audience. After a few minutes, Tobias seemed to get distracted. "Okay, guys, let's have some quiet so I can tell the story." He started again, but the laughter had grown. It was odd, hearing it now as it bubbled from the windows, and hearing it there as it barely began. Was this how Cassandra had felt, knowing what horrors were to come, but being helpless to stop them? One of the cameras fell forward then, and Shelley could hear the operator trying to stop himself from snickering. His loud chuckles cut through Tobias's story, and the feed on that camera suddenly went out. The other 2 cameras were still pointed at Tobias, no one having noticed the operator's laughing fit, and Shelley could still hear the audience chuckling below their sightline. Tobias tried to soldier on, but the laughter became louder, if not lustier. The laughter never rose above that canned alien chuckle, but it seemed to envelop everything it touched. Tobias cleared his throat, Shelley's mind allowing her a vision of his ordinarily placid face glaring over the crowd. Tobias hated to be interrupted, something not many people knew, and she could imagine that he was fuming. "Okay, that's enough. If you're not going to settle down, I'm going to have security removed." But the laughter was getting closer. Shelley could see the crowd swelling with it, as it made its way through it like a sickness. Though it stayed at that same monotonous tone, it grew in volume. You could hear Tobias's frustration turning into fear as it rolled on like a wave. The crowd came up just under the sight line, and Shelley could see them beginning to pool at the edges of the stage. The low light hid their faces, but her imagination treated her to a brief glance at the inky black faces and 2 big teeth of the creatures that she had seen. "Call security. Where's my manager? I need security here right..." But he stopped talking as Lucius began to chuckle. Lucius's mic crackled as he put his hand against it, but Shelley heard Tobias's gasp as the air cut harshly across his own mic. Tobias stood up, turning to Lucius as Cindy screeched in terror. Lucius kept laughing, chuckling as he fell from his chair and his legs bucked against the stage. Cindy was breathing heavily, asking Tobias what was going on, but Tobias wasn't sure. The 2 of them were moving, trying to get off the stage, but the chuckling audience was all around them now. The monotonous laughter was burrowing into Shelley's skull, and she felt a little like laughing herself. It was infectious. It was terrifying. It was devoid of all mirth or real joy, and was simply the sound of somebody rumbling their laughter for no better reason than to hear it. It sounded like the kind of laughter you heard in an insane asylum. It sounded like the kind of laughter you heard in hell. She could hear the broad tide of laughter that surged through the old building and out onto the street. Shelley began to wonder if this was the purpose of the building. Was it to house these things? They had seen them moving just outside their vision, but no one had questioned why the beasts were there. They were ghosts, after all. The spooky ambience was what they were here for. Despite Derek almost getting hurt, and despite all the craziness that had befallen them, Shelley had pushed forward with this. When she heard Tobias start to laugh through his fear, his laughter high and pealing before it became that monotonous canned sound, Shelley realized just how responsible she was. By the time the cameras cut out, the operators falling into fits of laughter, she closed the laptop and sobbed impotently. The police found her at a bar up the street a few hours later. They had been receiving calls after the cast had stopped and gone to investigate. They found everyone inside dead. They had asphyxiated, it appeared, but no sign of foul play could be determined. They had all simply stopped breathing and dropped where they lay, their faces stuck in a rictus of their final laughter. The police were talking about gas leaks, but Shelley knew what she saw. Those people laughed their lives away. They died from something they didn't understand, from something she still didn't quite understand. Shelley decided not to show them the footage. What good would it do, anyway? As she sat in her apartment later, Shelley still felt like she could hear that pervasive laughter as it tried to worm its way into her head. She hoped it would pass in time, but she felt like it might be the last thing she ever heard.